Hello? This is going to be another one of those rather free-form thought processes, as I'm just dealing with some of the ideas I wrote down earlier today. I was thinking about that phrase I used yesterday, alternative lifestyles. And upon reflection, it's a very strange phrase to use. Right. So in one sense, there are no alternative lifestyles, in that each individual person has a life which is different from every other individual person in some way. And in another sense, there are certainly alternative lifestyles, because when I say alternative lifestyles, I have something in mind. Okay? And this will depend on the norm I have in my head, right? I mean, so if I am straight up nuclear family, 1950s, dad works, mom stays at home, children are raised to get a job sort of setup, then we have, at least what is in America, the normal idea, right? You know, the expectation, the people you see on TV. But then even back in those times, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when we think of traditionality, you have situations like, let's say, the Addams Family, where it is the traditional life in a way, while at the same time, it most certainly is not. Right? They're kooky and strange, and they like weird things, and they live in this giant mansion, and the uncle is there as well, and all their relatives are weird, and they're scary, and so on. So you have a slight modification to the normal TV family. And then as you move onward and upward, you have slighter and slighter modifications. Maybe they're all teenagers. Maybe one of them is a vampire. Maybe one of them is a vampire slayer. And you end up moving on and on. You get to cartoons, for example, where you have different animals involved, and they each person is a different animal, and they represent some style of life, some personhood. And you get to anime, for example, coming in, where things can get really weird. Then you have modern times, where you might have everyone female or everyone male. Or you might have a cast and crew which are a certain type, and then you're going to throw in a curveball somewhere. Or you're going to have like Will and Grace, which is a setup which is not that traditional outlook. It's something a little stranger, more complicated. Then you have something like Friends, for example, which is a evolution from one type of relationship between a bunch of friends, where the dynamic is sort of set up about what is going on between each individual person, and over time that shifts and change. Well, you have someplace like Seinfeld, which is more along the lines of a group of friends, and it stays the same. They're the same people at the beginning of the show as they are at the end of the show, however many 7, 8 seasons it was. And I'm naming these shows because they're ones that I either watched recently or watched other people watch. You walk past the living room and you say, "Oh, what's on TV?" And you sit there and you look at the TV with them for 5, 10 minutes maybe. You sit down, you watch one show, and so on. And if we go back in time, then we can find stories again where, when you look at individuals and how they act or how they are placed within a relationship, or how they exist, then you have a norm sort of set up, or a norm in our head that we expect. Peasants and nobles. You have a show, and you can set that show and say, well, this person is a soldier, and this person is a priest, right? And they fit into a mold there, and so that is an individual lifestyle of the person, and yet their lifestyle is set within a whole structure, which is immediately understandable to us. But then, of course, we can read a book. Like I was reading this, Fire Becomes Certain. You know, it's a fantasy book in a fantasy world. And you're going through, and some things are set up so that you immediately understand what's happening. You know, these people, it's a story about the rich versus the poor. It's a story about, you know, this magical substance, which is basically oil, and also gunpowder, and also steroids, you know. So it's complicated, but also simple because it's centered. You are centered. The reader is centered into a certain view of how the world exists, and then the book is a slight modification of that. You know, you can read books like the Rune Lords, or 500 Years After, or The Accidental Sorcerer, which are all books I have on the table here, or, you know, The Page, or, you know, Protective the Small series, Dragon on the Border, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Exiles of Ambrai, you know, The Gates of Sleep, The Wish Song of Shannara. And within 10 to 50 pages, you know what to expect. And the only reason that is possible is because we already have a vision in mind of what a lifestyle is, and so it's just a slight modification of that. And so each of these books represents a world with an alternative lifestyle, right, where people live differently. But today, if I say alternative lifestyle, what I obviously mean is like you're gay, or you're trans, or you live in a polycule. But I can also mean, depending on where I am, I can also mean something like you live in a multi-generational household. You know, like 4 generations stacked on top of each other, sometimes literally, depending on how high or how many stories your house is. Or I can say it can be something like a person living alone. You know, and these are alternative lifestyles in the sense that they are different from each other. But when I say alternative lifestyle, what I generally mean to speak of is alternative within a certain subset of lifestyles. Not necessarily alternative to a certain subset of lifestyles, right? Someone can live a life which is technically alternative. You know, if they are, you know, paraplegic, or they are missing limbs, or they are autistic, or something of that nature, where their life is not quite quote unquote normal, but then we can talk to other people, and we can feel from that by interacting with individual folk that, you know, their lives are not really that different from us. Sometimes there are lifestyles which are more performative. This might be something like being goth and with the heavy makeup and whatnot. This might be something like dressing up and going to anime conventions, right? Wearing cosplay, which is slowly becoming, you know, less and less of an alternative lifestyle, in the sense that it is more and more accepted. You know, if you know somebody who is just your local dad with a wife and a kid, and sometimes he dresses up in Superman, goes to Comic-Con, that's not an alternative lifestyle anymore. That's not weird. It's not strange. It's a little different, right? But it's not unexpected to find. You wouldn't be like, oh wow, you go to comic conventions, that's okay. I don't really know what to say about that. You know, some shows like Big Bang Theory might have the in-universe characters being seen as strange because they go to conventions, but after you see that on TV for years and years and years, after there are people growing up with that situation, in their heads as a possibility of how someone might act, then they are no longer surprised when in the real world they see something like that. You don't have to be a super nerd to like comic books, for example. And in the 1980s or so, you have a show set in that time period, like Stranger Things. 1970s, 60s. I'm not exactly sure when Stranger Things is set. I should probably know what decade exactly it's talking about. I just know there are arcades. So 70s, 80s probably. I'm probably getting in trouble for saying that. Like, nobody's listening, right? I've seen Stranger Things, and I don't know what year it is set in. But what I remember reading, I wasn't alive then, of course, but what I remember reading about is the D&D scares over that they were satanic and people were consorting with the devil and whatnot. And you'd have parents worried, oh, my kid is playing with figurines and action toys, and they're talking about spells, so I need to stop this. I need to burn his books. I need to have him sent to a psychiatrist because he's playing D&D. And nowadays, this isn't seen as strange. Well, it's not the most common thing in the world, but neither is it unexpected to find, right? If you know somebody says, oh yeah, I play D&D in the weekends, you're going to think, that's a little nerdy. But you're not thinking, oh my gosh, they're the devil. To a great extent, the same thing has happened with the fact of, like being openly gay or trans or something like that, is that we know in the past that this was seen as alarming, and yet it's not unexpected to find out today. Like if I'm walking in Thailand, which I have done, and you run across somebody who is dressed as a woman but obviously a man, and then you kind of expect that because you're in Thailand and you've read about it and you're going, okay, that's a lifestyle that exists here. And then you walk in the United States of America and you're like, okay, I didn't expect that. It's a little strange. But then you see it on TV, some character, and you're going, oh, okay, I know that's like a Mr. Grizzly or a Mrs. Wallace character out there. Because when we talk about like alternative lifestyles, often what we mean is something visible. This may be skin color. This may be related to their accent when they speak, or to how they dress. And we see and hear these things and form an initial judgment of persons. This doesn't have to be in a good or bad sense, but just, if I hear a strong Indian, I can't do a strong Indian accent off the top of my head. If I hear a strong Indian accent, then I'm going to think, oh, that person is from India, when I turn around. And if I look and I notice, okay, so one thing I notice has happened to me is I used to live in Asia for a while, and you'd walk around and everyone would be Asian, right? Everyone would be, they're literally, everyone you see is Vietnamese, or everyone you see is Taiwanese, or, everyone you see is Balinese as you're walking along and living in a village. And then what happens is that becomes the new norm, the new expectation. And you have understandings of the people you see, like, okay, if I'm wandering around in the middle of Bien Hoa or Da Nang, and I see a bunch of Vietnamese people in a coffee house, in a little cafe, and I want to go up and order some food, then I'm gonna like, okay, how do I say coffee again? How do I say ginger ginger tea. You know, I'm reading down the list. Okay, what's going on here? You know, if I'm in Taiwan, I'm gonna go. Okay, I want to order food. Okay, okay, it's chow mein. You know, I have to try to modify it. It's gonna be a whole interaction. Like what I expect the interaction to be is a working out of of passing information between a language barrier. Right. And I'm going to expect, as I meet more and more people in the area, that they have a certain setup at home. I'm like, okay, yeah, of course, everybody lives with their grandparents. You know, all the kids I meet live with their grandparents. All the 20-year-olds I meet have to, you know, they have their own scooter or a bike. You know, and they go home and they wander around this way, and then as they talk about their life, I think, okay, that's what I expect and see everywhere. The interactions I have work because we're all polite to each other, and I sort of know the rules of politeness. And you'll have people who say things and they go, okay, I don't know why they're saying that. And then you realize why they're saying that, what the actual outlook here is like. You know, someone says, oh, I got to go home. I'm thinking, like, do you work tomorrow? If I'm in America. But a lot of times if I'm in Vietnam, I'm like, oh, you mean your parents said your parents called you and said you have to do something, is sort of what it seemed to be a lot of the time. As I read between the lines, I expect things. And then what would happen, I found, is that becomes the new norm, that becomes the expectation, that becomes what you see and feel and experience. And then you fly back home to the United States, you step off the plane, you see a black guy, and you know, your first reaction just not quite shock, but like surprise, like, oh yeah, that happens. People have different skin colors. Because you're not used to it after 6 months of living in Vietnam. And you're driving down the street of the city, and you're looking at it and you're seeing all these lawns, this giant, massive waste of space in front of every single store, where they could be building density and so on. We're having a housing crisis, and then we're also spending all this money on grass because I'm using up all our water. Right? And then I'm critiquing the place I grew up in and seeing differences about it that I didn't see before because I've experienced a different norm. And you know, now I walk down the streets of an American city and I don't notice these differences as much because I've accustomed myself to that norm. Again, you know, human beings take shortcuts because it is the only way we can function. Otherwise, you'd be getting out of bed every morning and going, oh my gosh, where am I? What's going on? You know, are the rules the same as they were yesterday? You know, instead you wake up, you greet somebody, you say, oh, hello, good morning. You know, how was your day? Did I miss anything? You know, do you want to eat something? Would you like part of this smoothie? You know, these sorts of bits. And you go to the store and you meet people on the street, and you go to work and you talk to your coworkers, and a lot of times you aren't really thinking at all. You're interacting with the situation, but you're not becoming overwhelmed by it. You're at work, and you know, the first few days or weeks at work, you're very concerned about how to do things and the order in which things happen and so on. After 5, 6, 7 months, you go in and you're pressing the buttons and you're barely thinking about what's happening. You're thinking about something else. You're having a conversation with your coworker as you log in to your computer and so on. You open up space in your head for more important considerations by taking mental shortcuts and condensing information. Okay, so our reaction often to an alternative lifestyle, to put it, is like this. You know, because we sort of have in our head how people act, and we work with that, and we know what people are, and we know what we should say and not say. But then we run across someone, and you know, one of our relatives comes out as gay, and you're like, okay, does this change how I talk to them or interact with them? I mean, that's the first process that goes through your head, because now they have said, oh, I was one thing. You thought I was one thing, but actually I'm something different. And now I can't take that I don't want to take that shortcut anymore, because new information is entered and I'm trying to evaluate if that information changes any of my interactions, right? Or if that information changes how I should see and understand them, or if that information changes what I should expect, right? I mean, say your brother comes out as gay, then within a few weeks, you're not going to be going, oh, did you find a girlfriend yet? You're not going to be teasing about that. But you may still tease and be like, oh, you can't find a boyfriend, sort of bit. But as you do that, as you do something like change the way you tease a sibling in regards to their failure of finding a romantic relationship, I mean, just something simple like that. It could also be about how they dress, or how they speak, or how they wish to be referred to, and all these little bits. But as you do that, all the information that you have accumulated during the past however many years can begin to become reevaluated. Right? You look at it again. When you thought somebody was a certain lifestyle, and then they are an alternative, and they have an alternative lifestyle, and it is a lifestyle in effect in a way that if I don't know much about, right? If that first relative I've met is terms of as gay, then I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Does that change anything? Apparently, they took the time to tell me about it. They took the time to inform me. It's the same as if someone is dressed up to the nines, or dressed up like they're got the gothic makeup on, or they wear a hat with a certain team's logo on it, right? They're giving me information. They're trying to be individualistic. And we, in interacting with people, do wish to be individualistic. We wish to acknowledge their individuality. We wish to treat with them in that way. We don't want to make jokes which are super offensive to someone we know. And, if they come out as a different lifestyle, then we have to test those boundaries again. But the problem, of course, which can happen is that those boundaries can be very, very sensitive, right? If someone comes out and says, I want to change this about myself, and it can be something as simple as, I don't want to work as a teacher anymore. I want to go fix motorcycles. I don't want to go on dates anymore. I'm finished with that. I don't want to talk about my parents' death anymore. This has consumed my life for so long, and I need to step away and stop that. And for them to tell you that requires an openness, but that only works in a personal, close relationship, or with someone who is in a state for themselves where they are confident in giving out this information without losing their own mental or emotional balance. Right? So if someone comes out as asexual, then they are telling you that presumably for a reason. Right? This is information which is important to them. But sometimes it turns out not to be important to them at all, in the sense that it doesn't change how they expect you to interact with them, right? If I hear through the grapevine that someone is, really into dressing up like a wolf, or, spends his spare time on the weekend volunteering at a homeless shelter, right? If I hear that through the grapevine and not from them directly, then the way in which I interact with that information changes as well during that moment, right? It becomes a part of their life that I'm not directly aware of. I haven't been explicitly given permission by them to interact with that aspect of their personality. that piece of their lifestyle. And so in some cases, I might feel comfortable entering into a situation. You're like, oh, I know someone who volunteers at a food closet, and I go, oh, I volunteered at a food closet, 2 or 3 times, and what was it like? I know what it was like, right? So I have a common connection with that, and so maybe I can enter into a conversation with this person, or I know to avoid that information, right? If you hear someone has gone through troubles with their parents, then I might say, okay, I've gone through trouble with my parents and I know how to sort of dance around that, and you're going to enter into a situation like that if you want to make a statement by saying, oh, well, this has happened to me and I heard that happened to you, and we have something in common. Or you might think, okay, well, for me, like the way I react to this information about myself is I don't particularly care to share it. Therefore, I'm not going to ask this other person about the information that they haven't decided to share. This is the way I tend to act, I think. If someone hasn't explicitly told me information about themselves, then even if I have deduced it, I don't tend to mention it or acknowledge it because I don't feel that I've been given social permission to enter into a dialogue in that case. Sometimes it's rather obvious. Where you look at someone and you think, okay, they definitely have something going on with them. And this could be an orientation. This could be that they are neurodivergent. This can mean that they have siblings. That's just different types of information and different names and methods for categorizing and placing people into categories so that we can take shortcuts in interacting with them, or that we can be aware of the social boundaries around certain types of information. Right? Like if someone is adopted, then asking them about their real birth parents is not something I'd ever bring up first in a conversation. I would be like, okay, well, I don't know if they're want to talk about that, and I don't know if I have any quote unquote good reason for asking them about that, so I won't even try. Of course, if you are deeply interested in someone, then some of these barriers might flow away, and you might find yourself doing a bit of Facebook stalking and trying to learn about them more deeply. And we can see that same interaction if you are entering into, say, a business deal, right? You're going to Google the company. You're going to, if you are going to endorse some politician, right? You're going to Google the politician and figure out, okay, who is this person? What's the story here? What's the history, right? And even if they didn't tell me explicit information, if I'm going to interact with them, or if I want to interact with them on a certain higher level, then I need to search out this information. And, in an ideal world, we should be able to go up and say, hey, I like you. I think you're interesting. I want to learn more about you. Can you mind if I ask you a few questions and take you to dinner or something? And this doesn't have to be a romantic version. This can be just, catching up with a friend you haven't seen in 5 or 10 years and saying, hey, Joan, right? It's been a while. Would you like to go see a movie and we'll catch up? Right? And you can do that because of this previous relationship you've had. But if you're entering into a new relationship with someone you don't know, then or you kind of wish to, then it's much more difficult to do that, is what I find. And there are people out there who are very confident in themselves and are able to do this with no issue. And for my part, I always find these sorts of people kind of creepy. But at the same time, you're a little flattered, right? Because I'm projecting my own biases and individual way of life upon how they act. And, as in, I'm thinking, okay, if I acted in the same way they acted, then I would be feeling this. Okay. And there are other situations where they're like, well, if somebody acts in the way they act, then I'm going to take my shortcuts using my social knowledge and say, they must be interested in me or not interested in me, or they're just being polite, right? I'm trying to figure out the level of engagement here I'm expecting, and it's not always direct. It involves a give and take and flow of information and subtext and overt text, which is incredibly complicated to understand. And so when I talk about, alternative lifestyles, I can also mean something like this, right? Like, okay, so if you have a person who is super religious, right? It is very different knowing someone is super religious and being told by someone that they are super religious, right? If they mention God in every third sentence, then I'm going to go, okay, they obviously have a bit of a obsession with this idea and this realm of existing. Okay, and they have an idea which is public, right? In that it involves how they present themselves to strangers or to people who barely know them. The same can happen with, just anyone in the world, right? You look at somebody and go, oh, they're wearing makeup. So they're this, in my head, I'm like, okay, if they're wearing makeup, the makeup is to improve a look on their face, so they care about how they look. So I should take that information into consideration. Okay, and why would they care about how they look? And so then we enter into a conundrum at that point, right? Going, well, socially, if you're female and then you are supposed to wear makeup, right? Or if you go back to the 80s, my mom would be like, we used to have to wear tights. Why? Who knows? But that was socially accepted. That was the case. That was what you wore. And if you didn't wear that, you didn't look like that, then it was regarded as strange because you weren't fitting in. You were being an alternative lifestyle. And then people had to spend extra time and effort in order to understand what was going on. And of course, people might be threatened by that. Be like, oh my gosh, she's butch. And, that's weird, because it's okay when they're a tomboy, but as they grow, they're supposed to leave tomboyness behind, but obviously they haven't. And now I'm thinking, okay, in one sense, the last tomboy I knew was in middle school, and now they're adults and tomboys, and that's a different situation. So how do I interact with that? And do I go back to the way I had acted and expected them to be when I was in middle school? But obviously that's not the case because they're adults now. And, you end up dealing with the unknown. And when you are in a situation like that, you sort of have two reactions people have. Okay? One reaction is that fear reaction, like, this is weird, this is strange, what's going on? The first time you walk down the street and you see someone with 15 metal piercings, right? Or their face is entirely covered in tattoos. And that's the first time you see something. Your reaction is either going to be, oh my gosh, that's cool. Or your reaction is going to be, oh my gosh, that's weird and kind of creepy. Right? Just on a visceral gut level. Because you're entering into a new situation. Okay, and the more you see that situation, the more you interact with people on an individual level and sort them into sets and subsets and types, and are able to use these mental shortcuts to consider how we interact with people, so that we then open up headspace for more complex, individual, and important interactions. Whether that be with the person themselves, oh, I want to get to know you. I'm getting past the fact that your eyes are making my throat dry up, or I want to speak to you. I'm getting past the fact that you're a woman with a beard, right? And we're getting past this fact because it is a fact that we already expect to be the case. Women not having beard, women with beard, that's a weird fact. Does that matter? Is it important? It might take me a day or a minute to figure that out. But if I've seen it before, or if I've read of it in a book, or I know that there's a celebrity like that, right? Then all of a sudden it's more, okay, I know what to expect here. You know, there are more complex and greater issues at play, but very potentially. You know, someone may be threatened by the fact that there's an alternative lifestyle out because they think that that lifestyle is dangerous, or they think that lifestyle is immoral for some reason, or they simply feel threatened by a situation which is different because of their own insecurities, or they are very confident about the way they live their life and how they exist. But then when somebody else gives them new information, then that confidence turns out to be somewhat hollow and or based on a belief about the way people are in general. You know, like if I come from a city which is 95% white and filled with nuclear families, then I walk into the ghetto and all of a sudden there's all these different people with different skin colors, you know, from purple to pale, you know, black and brown and, I don't know, green, yellow, because they're jaundiced, because they're malnutritioned, and so on. Bits and then the reaction immediately is going to be, okay, what is happening? I'm entering into a different social situation, right? And you are entering into a different situation, which is obviously clear to your eyes, you know? You know, the first time you meet someone, like, oh, you have like 4 kids from 4 different dads. Okay. Like, you know, I'm somewhat more used to that. And I have my own thoughts and biases about, you know, the situation where that happens. I go, okay, I know how you got into that situation, sort of know what happens, and I'm forming a judgment about who you are as a person, right? But if you're entering into a situation, like if I go to a town and I'm in the middle of Korea and I'm invited to tea, then I'm going, okay, what's happening? You know, I'm being very careful in that situation not to offend anybody, because I don't want to offend anybody, but I don't know the rules. So how do I fall back on a safe manner, right? How do I keep myself safe? I need to think in my head that, okay, we have a situation here, and I want to be polite in this situation. I want to show my politeness. I want to connect with them on an individual level. Because if I cannot connect to them on a social level, right? I'm sitting here and I'm having tea with 2 older ladies who want to learn about America, right? And I'm like, okay, connecting on a social level with a language barrier is very difficult. But if I can find a point of interaction which is individual, and like one of them mentions, oh, I was on a vacation in California once, you know, or, you know, my cousin works in Chicago, and I'm going, oh, okay, I can work with that. All right, let's focus on that. And so we may be facing an alternative lifestyle that is, you know, different from our own, different from what we expect. But if we have that individual connection, or we can make a connection, then all of a sudden we sort of know how that person fits into our worldview. We have an idea of the sort of thing they are. And at the same, and by doing this, we have an idea of the sort of thing they think that we are. Right? All of a sudden, the gears start turning again. Everything starts working. Okay. What were my other bits here? Oh, yes. Other notes. Okay, so not every alternate lifestyle is like a complete repudiation of culture. Often, an alternative lifestyle is something which, when you interact with it, is actually very minor. There's a situation where, like, me and my brothers, if we're talking about a couple if we talk about new friends we met or made, or my friends will be talking about this, right? Or my aunt is telling me about the girl her daughter met, right? Or I meet a couple who are at work, right? Or who come into the hotel and get a night, and they're both female, right? Then my immediate impression, or the way I think about that situation, or the way I discuss that situation with others, is like, oh, one of them's a guy, one of them's the guy, one of them's the girl, right? That they fulfill different social positions within a certain relationship, and that I am inclined to view their relationship, what I can of it, just trying to understand the situation I'm running into here, as the same in the same way that I understand the situation between, a guy and a girl, or one's a husband and one's the wife, right? I'm thinking, okay, well, how can I take this interaction and understand it? Well, I can understand it in, one of them's going to be the masculine, one of them's going to be the feminine one, and then I can put that into a certain phrase. I have certain expectations, and you start talking with the guy about cars, and you're going, all right, I mean, you're a girl, but you're also a guy, socially. And so now, someone else, the other person is talking about makeup, or talking about a boy band with someone else, and I'm going, I don't have any interest in that, so I'm trying to find a connection, and I'm like, oh, I'm closer to this person because they are more masculine, right? And I'm masculine, so we have a connection here. We can work with that, and that works because of a expectation I have, way of thinking. And as I interact with people on an individual level, those expectations fall away, and the differences and barriers become more precise because I'm not working with my shortcuts anymore. So I think this is something we tend to do as we interact with someone. Like, okay, if I'm walking along and I turn a corner, right, or I end up having a conversation with someone who is very goth-like, very much, look, they've got 4 piercings in each ear, they have white makeup, right? Or it could just be something simple like they're punkish, right? They have half their hair is pink, sort of situation. Then what is the goal, right? How do you get to, what I mean is, like, how do you get to know somebody, and how do you know what is important? The first thing you know about somebody is how they present themselves, how they dress, how they walk, how they talk. And then if I can understand that, if I understand, oh, look, I don't know what that team is, but it's obviously some kind of sports team logo they're wearing on their t-shirt, then I know something about that person just from that one instance. Okay? If they make an offhand comment about a pretty girl, then I know something about that person just from that one statement they've said. I'm going, okay, I sort of know where to place them in my head. And as I expand my worldview, as I talk to more and more people, as I create more and more social positions and more quick shortcuts, then that spectrum of default personalities which I place people into becomes expanded. And I go, okay, now there's like I have a relative who's gay, and my mother, like, the first time we went up, she was like, oh, by the way, so and so, and I'm like, okay. I stood there for a second. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Like, should I act differently? What's going on? Like, okay, I don't know what's going on. I haven't seen this relative for 10 years. We'll take it by ear. Right? Do you go up and you're like, okay, yeah, this is not something I find unexpected or weird or strange. It's not like I'm out here and all of a sudden I'm entering into my aunt's or my uncle or my cousin or whatever is welcome me into their home, and there's a polycule of 7 people, and I'm going, at 14, going, okay, this is a little too strange for me. I gotta slow down. It's like I'm interacting like, oh, and then there's the partner. Okay, I guess I have 2 cousins now. All right. You stop, you slow down, you take a deep breath, and you go, this doesn't actually change anything, does it? Right? Like, you realize that as you interact with individual people. And then say you grow up and you're 18 and you're going to college, and there's more lesbians there. And then you're traveling the world and you meet 2 girls who are traveling together in Europe, and you're going, okay, I sort of know what's going on here. I can read the subtext. And all of a sudden, you're just not like, oh, one of them's a guy, one of them's a girl. It's like, oh, there's like 4 different types of lesbians. Right? And then you start thinking, okay, well, that's the positions I place people in. And then eventually that whole idea starts to fall apart. And you're going, okay, there's not like 4 different types of lesbians as people. There's like 17 different types of people. And you begin to ask yourself, what is important, right? Now, if someone comes up and they present as very gay, there are some guy with a high-pitched voice, skimpy clothing, wearing makeup, talking about RuPaul's Drag Race, then with the information I'm getting is that their lifestyle, right, where they present themselves as, oh, I'm gay, by the way, very straightforwardly, is very important to them, right? I'm understanding that aspect of their personality is important to them. But then you run across someone else who's like, also happens to be gay, but bearish, I think is the term. And it's like, you look at them and go, well, you don't fit the stereotype I saw in High School Musical. So that whole situation becomes dispersed. The same can happen if you meet someone who is ultra religious, right? As you talk with more people who are ultra religious of different religions, you start to see a certain similarity, right? A certain, praise God in all things and at all moments and for all times, no matter what. And you go, okay, well, one of them's Mormon, one of them's Christian, another one's a different Christian denomination, this one's Islamic. And where you first have these shortcuts and you place them into their different religions, eventually those sort of disappear, those disperse, and you place them into the situation of, crazy religious, but only mentions it by praying at dinner, religious but doesn't talk about it, religious but only because their parents force them to. And so you begin to create these social subtypes in your mind, or individual subtypes in your mind as well. You can make. Okay, so what I find happens as a result of this is if you want to interact with people in a public setting, then you're going to set yourself up to present in a certain way. And we're going to do this because it is much more quick and efficient. Okay, there are folk who are entirely and completely individual, who you can't tell anything about them from the way they dress or talk or walk. Right, you have to interact with them person to person, face to face, soul to soul, to really get an understanding of what drives them and what works them. But these are very, very few. If I'm walking along and I talk to someone, you can tell within like 5 minutes, oh, this person is a hippie. 100% all the way, tie-dye, spirits and magic gemstones hippie. Why? Because they're going to mention it. There are the people who it takes you, hey, 10 minutes, or you might know them for 3 or 4 weeks before it comes out that they really like crystals. And then in that case, you're going, okay, well, they really like crystals and they're hippie-ish, but that's a lesser form of their personality because they're not displaying it. Okay. So what people can do, I think, is take a stereotype and work with it. Be like, okay, I fit this stereotype because I saw on TV that the people who do this, and act in such and such a way, talk in such and such a way, are interested in such and such things. I identified with that character I saw on TV, so I'm going to follow that. This happens in high school, right? Look, there's the goth girl, there's the goths, there's the posers, there's the people who like rock and metal music, there's the ones who are all preppy. These are the people who like these are the people who like soccer, and that's their entire life is soccer. There were a few people like that in my high school. Yeah, or these are the ones who their entire life is football. Or these are the ones who don't seem to have anything special about them, but then you realize one day that they volunteer for some organization every year which like hands out stuffed bears to kids. And you're thinking, okay, there's more going on here. But like that public-facing persona is what you first interact with, right? You talk with someone, you go, okay, they have given a shortcut. And we do this as people, right? The way I dress right now, the fact that my haircut, the fact that I have this braid is sending a message to the people I interact with. It is the first thing they see. And the message I am sending is, okay, it's a collared shirt, so it's semi-formal in a way, but it's also a Hawaiian bit, so I'm saying, so it's loose, so I'm formal, but loose. I've got short brown hair, but, if you pay attention, then I also have this braid, which says that I'm a bit weird, right? And so I'm giving I would say like a mixed message. And there's a difference between doing this on purpose and doing this accidentally. I picked up a shirt because all my shirts are on the ground, and this was the first one I found. So I think it might be wrinkled. My hair is getting long because it's not really in my eyes yet. It tends to stick up. And I should go get a haircut, but I've been too lazy to do that for the past week, even though I tell myself every day that I should go up and get a haircut. I have a braid as a memento to remind myself of something. And so the issue I tend to have with thoughts like that is I don't know how much someone is dressing up in order to express themselves, how much someone is dressing up in order to hide themselves, or how much someone is dressing up for themselves. Right? Like my issues tend to be something like, if I'm talking to a girl and she's dressed up to look pretty, then I'm thinking, okay, so is that because she wants others to think she's pretty? Is that because she is trying to send a message about who she is? Or is that because she just likes wearing, dresses which accentuate her figure, right? Like, trying to interact with that is more difficult because I don't know the thought processes that goes through a pretty girl's head. But if I see a guy, then I generally know, like, okay, I can more easily deduce why he's dressing the way he's dressing. Right? If I look at and I'm like, oh, that guy's wearing makeup, then I'm thinking in my head, that guy's wearing makeup because he wants people to look at him and think he's pretty or handsome, right? He's trying to impress somebody because guys don't really wear makeup just off the cuff like, it's not a social norm. It's not something that's expected. And I know this because I'm in the position of a guy and I have entry into that social knowledge And not only entry, but I have confirmation of that social knowledge, right? I've been in that situation. And gone, okay, if I go to this super masculine area, right, where it's a baseball game or something, and I'm obviously wearing makeup, then I'll come off as strange. And I get that feeling and get that understanding, right? If I go to tea with the girls and I am dressed up in a, I don't know, baseball uniform, or I'm dressed up a little too nicely, or I'm dressed up very slobbishly, then why am I, like, I'm thinking that I'm entering into a situation here, I'm passing a message, and so on. And I'll find myself thinking of this too. I'll find myself going, okay, I should not wear this shirt because it has food stains on it, sort of bit. Whereas if I'm going to see my brother, I'm like, yeah, food stains, whatever. Right? It's not important to me in that situation. But it's hard to know why people do the things they do sometimes. Because we can take refuge in a trope. We can take refuge in the way we dress or act, or in the jokes we make, in the topics we discuss. Now, I haven't been in a group chat with like my male friends for years, because the group chat evolved into like this sexual, racist, endless meme joke of insults. And it didn't begin as that, but it it slowly morphed over time into a certain social type of social interaction, which I was uncomfortable with. Okay, and that grows over time, and then what you notice is that, like, your friends start to talk to each other in a certain way and interact with each other in a certain way, and they start to become not stuck in a rut exactly, but very, very solidified in their histories and their stories, right? They know who they are. They know what they're getting from each other. They know what to expect. They know how far they can go in insulting somebody, but having it come off as a joke. They're like, they know that an insult in this situation among these people is actually a term of endearment, because there's language codes going on here. The language codes hold because of the position we hold and our histories with each other, and so on. Whereas I go into a situation like that and go, I'm not comfortable with this manner of interaction, so I'm going to back away a bit. And I remember trying to tell a few jokes once in a while, and it just falling flat. I'm like, okay, obviously, whatever's going on here, I don't work with it very well. I don't feel comfortable doing this. I'm going to back off. But I think there is a very strong incentive, we all know this, I would say, to keep going, to go, okay, I found a shortcut for interaction. I found the codes and the words to use in order to get through this situation, and I'm going to keep going with that. This happens at work too. If you're sitting at the front desk and someone comes up and they start complaining, then the first time it happens, you're very worried. You're like, okay, let's understand what's going on here. The second time, you're going, okay, I sort of know what's happening. By the 50th time someone comes up to you with the same stupid complaint, and by this time, I'm thinking this is a stupid complaint because I've heard it over and over and over again. And it may be stupid because, hey, it's corporate, says this is the rule. I can't change it. I'm gonna get in trouble. I'm gonna get rid up. I might get fired if I, do this thing for you that you want me to do because corporate says I can't. Or look, I know you booked through this website, but I'm not in charge of that, and they haven't sent the information to our system. So I can't help you. All you can do is sit around until Booking.com sends us the information in the system, and I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know if you did something wrong back in there. Show me your receipt. Show me your reservation, and I'll see if it makes any sense. Oh, you made it 35 seconds ago before coming in. Yeah, we don't have it yet. If you should have made it, but this website will send it to us really fast. And eventually what happens is you begin to just sort of automatically reply, automatically interact. You're like, okay, yeah, da 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 da. You know, this is the rule, this is the action. You know, this is the history. You know, your eyes glaze over, and I'm starting to think about something else as I'm talking to you, because I have engaged my mental shortcuts in order to get through this conversation, because I know exactly how it's going to end. Okay. Okay, so as we get back to something like an alternative lifestyle, the same situation happens. Like I remember there was I used to go to a card shop and play Yu-Gi-Oh, and there was a guy there who was a dwarf, you know, 3 feet tall, liked to play with knives for some reason, which was kind of creepy when I was 16. But you know, like, you know, the first time you enter it, the first time you see him, you know, playing cards, the first time you sit across from him at a card table, and you're like, I'm pulling out my Blue Eyes deck. Right? Then I'm going, okay, what is important in this interaction? You know, what is important here? Oh, we're gonna play cards. You know, so anything to do with his height is unimportant here. It doesn't involve the way I interact with him in this moment. And so, you know, you play cards, and then you separate, and you're like, okay, you know, that's Carl. After a few weeks, you know, that's Carl, and you know, you talk with him sometimes. You hear him talk with other people. You play cards, and this alternative lifestyle. I say alternative lifestyle because you know, when you're 3 feet tall, that's a different way of going through life. It's not necessarily a different style that you chose, right? It is just a different situation. You know, the same thing can happen if you are in a wheelchair, or if you are 6.5 or 7 feet tall, right? And I'm calling it an alternative because it's not what I expect as norm, which is, you know, you're going to be between like 5'3" and 5'10" or so. You have use of all your limbs. Sort of information, and I don't know if the fact that they're short or tall or big or thin or whatnot is important until I experience the situation a few times and I realize it is not, right? And I may be able to tell myself this beforehand, right? And may be able to go, yeah, there's nothing different because of this situation, that information I know about the person. But I have to take the time to evaluate that, even if it's the most innocuous thing, even if it's like, oh, they're a redhead. Then I remember like lots of ginger jokes when I was in high school. There were ginger jokes were being thrown around a lot, and I'm going, okay, is this something I can joke about if I meet someone with red hair? You know, so if I make a new friend and it's a guy and he has red hair, and all my history says, you know, guys interact with each other through insults and jokes, then can I make a joke about his red hair? You know, and if I hear what I'm going to do, my person, right, is I'm not going to do that. And if I do end up making a joke, then I'm going to end up waiting for someone else to make a joke about his red hair first, and then I'll make my joke. Right, because he laughed at the other guy's red hair, you know, ginger joke. So now I can make my own. And you know, that may never happen because I can't come up with a joke, or I don't see why it's funny, or I realize that I'm repeating the same joke that the other guy did before because I'm not actually trying to involve myself. I don't feel the ginger hilarity here. I don't have the class clown gene sort of bit going on. You know, I can't pull funny out of me at the drop of a hat like, you know, my friend so and so can. So you know, I may try to make a joke and then I fail, and then I go, okay, obviously that is not needed. Let me try a different way of interacting. Let me try a different way of talking with somebody. So one other problem that can happen is, of course, when you can't connect with somebody. When you're talking with them, and like this, this can happen with customers, for example. Some guy, I mean, okay, like the most difficult customers to have are generally going to be like a 55-year-old overweight white guy coming in. Because he's going to be very self-assured. He's going to be very confident. He's going to be very rude. He's going to be very much, I expect this and this and this, and this is how things are supposed to go. And I am in top of the world, and I'm powerful. Look at my muscles. And he's not old in the sense that he's frail and, retired. And he's not young in the sense he's kind of unsure of himself and figuring out. No, he's in the prime of his life, and he's some middle manager, and he's kind of angry. Or he's a high level manager, or he's the owner of a business, and he's like, or he's good chance he's ex-military at some point, and he's just like very sure of who he is and what he wants. And if you can't fit into his way of viewing the world, it's going to be a problem. And you also run across Karens, for example. I would say that, as I work with stereotypes, you have Black women of a certain age can be especially difficult. You have bits where you see a bunch of teenagers come in, and you start to prepare yourself. Okay, let me make sure. Let me find the one who is calm and talk with them. Right, and I have these stereotypes in my head where I form immediate first person ideas in my head of how to interact because of history I've had beforehand. I have expectations just in the way someone looks or acts. And then I'm surprised. And then when someone looks or acts differently, I don't have that expectation, so I turn into a more hesitant situation. I'm trying not to offend because I don't know what the offensive boundaries are, or I'm interacting with somebody and I have to tell them no, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I tell them no in a way that will not cause them to freak out on me? And that someone comes up and is like, I want a room at your hotel. And it's obviously he's tweaking out in some sort of drug, and I got to tell him no. Then I have to go, okay, how do I follow the interaction here? How do I talk with this person and not have them, pick up the teapot and throw it at my head, which happened to my boss once. No, it was a flower pot. Yeah. Some lady like picked up a flower pot in the office in the front office and threw it at his head. How do I deal with these self versus outside situations is going to be the other bit here, because I've been talking about how I deal with other people, right? How I do not offend them. How do I connect with them? How do I understand them? How do I place them into some shortcut in my head so that I can get past whatever issue it is? Someone walks in and like missing an eye, and the first thing I'm thinking is, okay, they're missing an eye. They got an eye patch on. The second thing I'm thinking is, okay, let me see who this person is beyond the eye patch, but you do have that first visceral interaction. And if you have history with certain people, or history with like a certain accent, and the way someone speaks reminds you of someone else that you once knew that caused trouble for you, or the way someone looks, right? Like I remember I was walking down a street in Oaxaca once, and I still remember this. It was, I want to say like 12 years ago or something. There was a guy in front of me, and the way he was walking, and his build, the way he was dressed, his haircut, everything looked almost exactly like someone else I knew. And for a second there, I stood in the street, and I'm like, okay, let me back away slowly because this person is dangerous. I'm thinking, wait, I don't know anything about the person at all, except that from behind they look like someone I know, And it's the same when I hear a certain like I want to say like ghettoish accent with a whine to it. Like, oh, that reminds me of someone I knew in middle school and in high school, and they talked exactly like that, and we did not get along. And so my first reaction is, okay, I formed an opinion about you based on the fact that you look like or sound like someone I knew beforehand. Yeah. Or just, when I talk about, the most difficult customer is going to be a 55-year-old sort of heavy set white guy who's very sure of himself. How do I know that? Because I say that because my most difficult customers when I worked at a hotel were that sort of person. Because, they wouldn't take no for an answer. And when they try to convince you of something, they're gonna lean over and they're gonna loom over you. And they're going to start to sound a little angry because, being angry has worked for them before. And I got to stand there at 120 pounds soaking wet, staring up at this giant Hulk and go, I'm sorry, sir, I can't help you. And I know you're trying to be quiet, but you're really screaming really loud. Right? Or I'm talking with someone, I'm going, okay, ma'am, I know you're going to be offended by this because I'm telling you no. I already know what to expect. I know how you're going to react because I've seen you or someone like you, someone fitting your stereotype react in a certain way exactly like that before. And as I'm speaking this, as I'm saying this, right, I have specific people in mind. I have visions in my head of interactions I had which were exactly like this. So I formed a sort of shortcut in my head for how to interact with them, not only on an outward level, but also on an inward level, right? I have my own expectations of what to expect. And my own ways of steeling myself for a confrontation, or my own ways of relaxing because this person isn't dangerous, or this person reminds me of someone I liked once, or this person reminds me of a PE teacher who I really got along with. Right? Like, I'm gonna look at a black guy who's 55 and bald and think, oh, that looks just like my karate teacher. That looks just like my PE teacher, who I got along well with. So I end up going, okay, that looks just like this friend I had in college. And go, okay, well, I'm immediately more relaxed around that person because they remind me of someone else. Even if I know in my head that they may have nothing whatsoever in common, right? They may be completely different people with completely different activities and ways of interacting with the world. But I do form those shortcuts based on how they act or appear, and those shortcuts aren't only social interactions, they're also my internal responses based on my history. Which is why I would say the depiction of alternative lifestyles, or the depiction of different types of people in television and in books, can be so important because it gives the watcher a sort of handle on the situation, right? And it may not be much of a handle, but instead of standing there going, oh my God, I've never met a gay person before, you can go, okay, gay, that means he's like, God, who is, it's like Will on Will and Grace, okay? Ding. Or they're Canadian, they must be like Robin Scherbatsky from How I Met Your Mother. Or they are, I don't know, Asians, they must be like Jackie Chan. And these are horrid examples of stereotypes which may have nothing whatsoever to do with who people are. So that occasions another sort of problem because of that. It does give you a handle, and you go, okay, this isn't the first person I've met who is like this. But at the same time, the person I've met who is gay isn't at all like Will. They're very different. And so now I have to think, okay, is this different enough that I interact with them? and that changes on an outward level. But I think on an inward level, it doesn't so much. You're like, okay, they may not be like this character I saw on TV, but I've already formed this initial emotional reaction to them because of the character I know on TV. Like I have a not a handle perhaps, but like I have a fingertip on the weight scale, which sees them in a certain way and places them in a certain place in the world. So that does occasion another sort of issue, right? If like all the villains you see are of a certain type, that says something else. We've known this problem for quite a long time, that if you see for a long period of time, if you were a black person in a movie, you were probably like a villain, or you were really ghetto. Or if you were in a scary movie, you died. And so you have negative stereotypes as well, which can interact with people. And I have met people who like have never, that is, I've known people who have never like talked to a black person, like straight up 100% never happened. And I'm going, I don't know how you get to the age of 45 with that going on, but I understand why you're a bit nervous visiting South Sacramento with me or something, because you've never dealt with that situation. And it's not, and even if I know it's not strange or weird, they may not know. They may know intellectually, but but emotionally, they're like, "Oh my God, we're going to the ghetto. We're going to get shot." I'm like, okay. There's the ghetto, and then there's the ghetto, right? We're going to a store or like a card shop or whatever, a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament that's a little bit sketchy, yeah. Like you might get ripped off. People are gonna are gonna offer you some bargains to undervalue your cards, but you're not gonna get shot. Like your understanding of the situation here is not relevant with reality. Which is, you want to have this sort of rolling onward complexity, but this also occasions sort of certain problems, in that how do you can end up reinforcing stereotypes for good or bad, but you only have a certain limited number of stereotypes to choose from. You can't, if a show, for example, tries to include every stereotype of person they can think of, then you lose the audience, you lose the direction of the show, and it becomes more performative. So it's better to show it, to focus on one or two or three general character types. Like what is it, the Life and Times of Kimmy Schmidt or something, and there was a character Titus who was a very particular type of individual. And as you get to know this character bit, then you run across someone in the wild who sort of acts or looks like that, and it's easier to work with. But I do sort of wonder, like, how complex can you make a character before they start to lose some cohesion? Because an individual person can be incredibly complex. I can be talking with a friend, and through a long history of years, I've seen them change. I know 50 different aspects of their personality and how they act in different situations, and or when whether they're angry or sad right now might influence what sort of joke I can make with them. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. Okay, so then the last two little notes here I have are, okay, so if I don't know the rules of a situation, if I am going to Japan for the very first time, all by myself, how do I act in such a way as to not offend somebody, such a way as to not cause myself problems. Well, the way to act is, first of all, to be individual, right? To seek to escape these social interactions because I don't know what they are. I don't know the social rules. I don't know the social history, and connect with people on an individual level. You're talking to them. You look them in the eye. You smile. You try to be honest at times. You may stumble over your words like I'm doing here. You may become confused, but you're hoping that by showing yourself as vulnerable, as showing yourself as authentic and honest, that they understand any mistakes you made, right? That they have been in a similar place in their life where they have entered a situation where they don't know all the rules, or they're not comfortable with what's going on, or they've been confused and scared, or they've been, feeling hopeful about the future. So you seek to escape these stereotypes by being an individual, but you can't do that in all times, in all moments in everyday life. It's way too much information, and you're eventually going to meet people who take advantage of you being open and cause you damage, attack you. All right, look, these are internet trolls you're going to face, right? By having a video and putting it out, you're going to face comments which are negative towards you. Doesn't matter what you say, right? Do you expect that negativity? How do you deal with that negativity? How do you have the self-confidence to know that you are going to make mistakes and say things which are going to be misinterpreted or misquoted or misused, or say things which you will then have to take back as you think about it more, or say things which you are trying to explain but your explanations are not very good, or trying to explain something, and halfway through the explanation you lose your train of thought, or you realize that you're saying more than you thought you were saying. And confidence is very important for that. I have to be able to say to myself, to know for myself, hey, I'm going to make mistakes and I have to live with that. I'm going to involve myself in a social interaction and I'm going to be awkward. I'm going to offend somebody. Like, that is just how life works. And I'm going to be offended when somebody says something to me. That's how life works. We are not all perfect. And if I have my own personality, my own history, and I can understand them through individual means, if I can expend that energy in order to not deal just with stereotypes, then that to me seems like the core of confidence. What can happen is people attempt to fake that. They attempt to say, well, I am a certain person, I have a certain lifestyle, and this is how I live, this is how I expect others to act towards me, and as long as we stick to the script, I'm fine. But when challenged on an individual level, then the veneer starts to fall apart and you learn who they really are, and perhaps they aren't that confident. Perhaps they won't even tell themselves that they are unconfident, right? They are false. They give false bravado even to themselves, and they dive deeper and deeper and deeper into a stereotype. I think we all do this to an extent and for a time. Like, there's bits of my life where I'm like, you know what? I'm a nerd. That's what I do. Now, I like anime. I like Yu-Gi-Oh! Let me just dive into that and make that my, maybe not my entire personality, but a good chunk of my personality based around something like this. And, if I find people who I can interact through that level, through that stereotype, through that messaging, right? If I go, oh, I like anime, someone goes to an anime convention and talks to people about anime, I'll connect with them on that level. And that works until it gets to a point where you stop and I don't watch as much anime as I used to. So now I go to conventions and it's a little harder because I'm not involved in the lifestyle as much anymore. And I have to realize who I am. And as we do that, as we become more individual, we start to lose the ability to connect with other people on a trope level, on a surface level, is what I feel is part of the problem which can arise. And, this is what happens to people, to folk as they grow older, is what can be the case in the past is not necessarily the case in the future. To know people, like if I want to get to know people, if I want to make friends, then what do? Well, I'm going to join some sort of organization. I'm going to go join the pickup soccer game down the street. I'm going to take an acting class. I'm going to go watch some movies. I'm going to go to a convention. I'm going to go to the 4th of July parade. And sit in the audience and clap and say something to the person next to me. Which is utterly performative. And I'm doing that because it is the quick and easy way to gain a connection, and then perhaps we can build upon that connection later. Okay, the problem I of course have, and there's a personality subtype that sort of the idea is that I want to connect on an individual level, but I'm unsure of how to get there because I would have to step through the social levels first, and at a certain point I'm just really, really tired of doing that. Right? I feel like I'm being fake sometimes, and so I attempt to overcompensate, or I attempt to wait and be quiet in the background to evaluate who people are so that I can connect to them personally, right? You have these own particular problems and issues. So what I find is that when I say alternative lifestyle, I have something in mind, right? A norm as opposed to an alternative. But as we grow into ourselves, we each become an alternative lifestyle. We each become an individual who is less stuck in a mold. Until, of course, we become stuck in a mold and find ourselves unable to move past that. Right? If you spent, I've had older relatives who haven't made any new friends in 30 years because they found a place they were comfortable in and stayed there. I know other folk who at 75 are literally traveling the world by themselves and meeting someone new every day. They have different ways of interacting with folk, and I'm trying to figure out, which one is better. Because each of them has their problems. If you're in one place and you're following a trope, and you have the same friends, and it's always the same, and then you're building history and you're building connection, but it can be hard to move beyond that because you end up hitting a certain limit, a certain level, and other people and people change, right? Friends I had before have moved on, or I have moved on. It's hard to tell which is which, right? Just a difference has grown, a gulf has come into being, and so you may have friends for 10 years, but then you slowly fall out of being friends. Then you may slowly fall back into being friends, but then I know other folk who are like, you can be friends with, but it's more performative friends. Like we're friends because we've been friends for so long, but not because we actually like or interact with each other. And, this is something that happens eventually. You realize, oh, I'm always the one that contacts so-and-so. Like I've gone over to so-and-so's house by myself for, 5 years, and we play games, we have fun, but then they never come over here, and as I end up doing something else, as I have some information, as I have to move out of town, the friendship sort of fades away because they aren't putting in the effort. And you have to determine, am I putting in the effort? Am I being open? Am I allowing them to interact with me in a certain social way? Like, we play games, for example. We play League of Legends. Or am I demanding that we have a close connection? How are you doing? What's going on? What do you think about this? Are you worried about politics? Sort of bit. And they're going, well, I haven't talked to you in 2 years or 6 months or something. and it's a little harder now, or they may have some issue going on in their life that they don't want to talk to me about because we've grown apart, or because our interactions have just been through the means of a sort of tropey social level. Right? Or our personal interactions have only been of a certain type. There's lots of variation in here. Okay, so finally, the last bit is, okay, when you're dealing with this confidence and bravado situation, when you're dealing with folk who are putting on a play, they can even be putting on play for themselves. Be like, oh, look at me, I'm so and so. I'm this type of person. I'm super gay, or I really like working with tools, or I am a computer person, or I play video games. That's what I like, or I'm a soccer coach, and that's everything I do with that's everything I do. Yeah. Or I am my job sort of person. Or I hate my job and I hate everything, and I've known people like that. It's like everything they say is negative, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't deal with this negativity forever and ever. And so, it all comes back to when I say alternative lifestyle, what I mean is social interactions. What I mean is placing people into molds, is labeling people as certain things in my head and putting them into a certain position in the world so that I know how to interact with them and are comfortable with interacting with them before getting to know them on a deeper, more personal level. Okay? And there are folk who dislike this, right? There are folk for whom the way they see the world is more opposite, right? There are folk where their social position, the fact that they are of a certain religion, or that they are of a certain race, or that they are of a certain orientation, or that they have a certain job, or that they are a certain political party, is for them the most important part of their life. Because that is either the lens through which they see the world, or that is the means by which they interact with the world. And these folk, I find, often have a sort of a sense of justice. Whether or not it's an empathetic justice is a more complicated situation. I find often at times it's not very empathetic at all. It's very self-focused, very, very selfish way of looking at the world, where everything is on this level of position, on this level of impersonal relation, on this level of your social status of one sort or another. And these folk often, have an idea of mind of how the world should be, and they're going to push that idea. They have an idea of people who dislike them, and so they're going to immediately attack those folk. They have an idea of who they are, and they find any challenge whatsoever to that idea, to the pillars of their personality, as existentially threatening. And then you have me. And I think I represent another type of person who is quieter, right? Less focused on the big questions of how do we interact with racial problems? How do we interact with social problems? How do we interact when we have differing ideas of politics? And for me, a true connection understanding is kind of past all those. Like those are examples of how someone might act in the world, but they're not necessarily examples of who they are as a person, right? Are they good or bad? Are they going to hurt me or help me? Are they going to tell the truth? These are more important because they are involved in personal interactions, and I'm trying to connect with people on a personal level, trying to be honest, because I've worked in that social space for so long that it becomes tiring and performative, and you realize that at least for me, like I realize it doesn't get me anywhere. You know, if I go and I join the local soccer game and I'm there and I'm playing soccer and I'm trying to make friends by playing soccer, to me that feels wrong. To me, it feels like I should make friends and then play soccer with my friends, right? I should reverse the situation. Of course, that doesn't always work very well. So now I have very few friends because it turns out that you meet people first through a social level and on a impersonal, interactive level. And for me, at least, this takes a long time to morph into a friendship. So if I move around a lot, or if I spend a lot of time in my room, or if I spend a lot of time at work, then I find that I don't meet new people, or I don't become close to new people unless they are close to me for an extended period of time. And so I can sometimes over-rely on social knowledge, on stereotypes, because it allows me to short circuit a connection and feel as if there is a connection when one has not yet actually formed, which ends up, sort of damaging my chances, because I end up in a situation where I have a certain connection with somebody and then I'm unsure of how to move beyond that. And it seems like I should have, I don't know, it feels to me as if I should have started on a more personal level and then moved into interacting on a social level. Like, I want to know, who are you as a person, and do we have fun talking to each other? Do I think you are a good person? Do I think you are have interesting ideas? Do I think you're open up to discussions on sensitive topics, or do I have to be careful around you and quiet? Right? And then from that point on, you go to, let's go do something, like watch a film, go hiking. It's you. I don't know, I do things backwards, I suppose. So I started this whole bit about alternative lifestyles, and then I describe my own lifestyle, which to all appearances is normal from the outside, but on the inside feels alternative, right? As I argue with my own expected reality that I find, and I go, I don't feel as if I fit too well into that situation. So how do I create a new situation where I do fit in? How do I have that force to change the world to fit me, while at the same time not being someone with an ardent justification for changing the situation, because I don't really care that much about the social situations. I'm more focused on how these situations impact me particularly, right? So I'm reading a book about racism right now, and then I read a book about capitalism before this. And if I get mad, or I get annoyed, or if I raise my voice, or I become incensed, or I exhibit some strong emotion, then that is because I feel that it is affecting me particularly in some way, or it is because I am frustrated with how people think or interact with an issue, and I'm going, the answer is simple, but apparently it is quite complex. And why is it complex? It's not complex because on a personal level we can't connect. It's complex because on a social level we can't connect. We have different goals and viewpoints on how the world is, and those are getting in the way of a person-to-person talk. These are getting in the way of me in improving myself in a philosophical manner by confronting my own demons and problems directly instead of indirectly. So as I talk about, alternative lifestyles, the point isn't to point out an alternative lifestyle. The point is to attempt to understand what a lifestyle is, what is a way of interacting with life, and what is the method by which people live. How do I take shortcuts and yet how do I not take shortcuts is what I'm trying to get at, right? I'm, confused and wondering all around and opening myself up and talking to myself on a camera, working through my own thoughts in my mind in person, trying occasionally to make a rhyme so that everything comes out perfectly on time. And even if it's not all right, at least it's not all wrong either. There's something in me which says I should be a fighter. I should try to stand up a little higher and make my spirit a little lighter so that the fire I put out is clear without smoke. Shows a light and leads me to speak, not to choke. Because I can.